welcome to Spotlights. This is the podcast for the Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology. And as usual, I'm your host, Sam Mickey. And this week, I'm really excited to welcome onto the show Norman Wirzba. Norman, welcome.
Yeah, great to be with you, Sam. Thanks.
Yeah, I really appreciate you making the time for us. For people who don't know you already, you're the Gilbert T. Rowe Distinguished Professor of Theology at Duke University and Senior Fellow at Duke's Kenan Institute for Ethics. You write on a really wide variety of topics, under the umbrella of theology. You have environmental philosophy, ethics, food, food studies, sustainable agriculture, and author of several books. I'll just name a couple: From Nature to Creation, Way of Love, Food and Faith, The Paradise of God, and many edited volumes as well. What we want to talk about today is a brand new one coming out of Cambridge University Press, and it's This Sacred Life, Humanity's Place in a Wounded World, which I think is something people are really feeling right now, the woundedness of the world. So to start us off, let's kind of talk about the wounds a little bit. You seem to be aware that the context for doing theology at all has changed dramatically in recent decades with the deterioration of the natural world. And so you open up by introducing us to the idea of the Anthropocene. And so I wonder if you can kind of situate what you're doing in that context, the wounded
Yeah,
world.
sure. So for about 12,000 years, people have been living in a period that geologists refer to as the Holocene, which is a period in which really the great civilizations of human, society have taken root and flourished. And it's been a pretty remarkable run. And in the course of those 12,000 years, the planet seemed infinite in its ability to manage whatever it is human beings wanted to do with it. And I think what has been such a shock to, and this is not just sort of philosophers, theologians, humanist type folks, it's Earth system scientists who really were the ones who coined this new term called the Anthropocene, even though it's been taken up by all sorts of people since then. But what people like Paul Crutzen and others came to the realization of is that human beings are no longer subsumed by nature, right? That we are somehow very small, vulnerable, weak beings in this otherwise great expanse we call nature. No, we are now the primary agents driving Earth system processes from the cellular all the way to atmospheric levels. So there isn't really a place on Earth that we can go where we don't see the reach of human economies and human technologies. And there have been all sorts of discussions about when does it start? How is it best marked? Is it something like the development of colonialism in the 16th, 17th centuries, where mostly Europeans are going all over the world and in doing so upsetting ecological balances? Or should we think of it as the birth of the Industrial Revolution with the coal-fired steam engine, which of course begins the process whereby CO2 goes into the atmosphere in unprecedentedly quick ways? So there's a lot, and we can also talk about nuclear isotopes that are now registering in the geological record, or some are saying, no, it's the great acceleration when mass consumption starts in the 50s after the Second World War. So there's lots of debate about it. And what I wanted to do is not sort of settle the debate, but to simply raise the question about how the Anthropocene changes the way we think about the human presence on the earth. What is it revealing about the way we think about what kind of a world we're living in, but also who the human being is within the world and what's appropriate for them to do?
Right. I really appreciate that. I mean, there's some works out there that have really beautiful things to say about like theology and nature, and when you read the book, you wouldn't necessarily know that we're undergoing this kind of a crisis. And sometimes it's easy to just kind of be like, well, we can just put that aside. And I'm like, I think it's really important to talk about this. The future of life on Earth is at stake, and certainly the future of humanity.
I
And
think it's not just theologians. I think,
yeah,
philosophers, economists,
yeah,
so, I mean, psychologists are now, becoming more attuned to this as well because they're
it's true.
realizing that eco grief
Yeah,
is now a major factor in the mental health of so many people. And a lot of economists haven't gotten the word that we're living on a very vulnerable planet and
Yeah,
that we are promoting economies that are deeply destructive and, of course, simply unsustainable. So, a lot of folks are not paying attention. And so, I would say this, it's the whole swath, and universities at large need to, I think, wake up
yeah,
to these kinds of realities, because I don't know that there is many a discipline within a university that isn't affected in some way
yeah.
uh, by the kinds of things we're talking about.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And then some people are like oddly excited about this. And they're like, no, this is, the future of
Yeah.
humanity is about this kind of technological
Yeah.
domination of the planet. And so one of the things I thought was interesting in the book is you get into the transhumanist movement, and these
Right.
people are like, no, we're moving beyond humankind, and this kind of meshing with technology
Right.
is the future. So like step on the gas. We don't need to
Yeah.
pump
Yeah.
the brakes right now.
Right. Yeah. Step on the gas and fuel it all the way to another planet, not
Yeah.
just step it on the planet here. But yeah, there's so much in this technophilia that we see around us that, on the one hand is pretty enticing, because we think that, and have been told for a long time now, that technology is going to be the silver bullet that saves us. And I think more and more people are becoming deeply suspicious of that impulse. And part of it is that we're seeing that in all the sorts of innovations that come forth, many of which have been really fabulous, right? I don't want to go back, and I don't pose as a Luddite by any means. I
Right.
don't want to go back to a period before we have antibiotics or before we have indoor plumbing or things of that
Yeah.
sort. Not at all. But I think what we have to ask is, what are the sort of the limits in which we make a conversation about when is a good technology deployment worthy of our subscription or not. And we don't have many places in which we can have that conversation. And the reason we need to have it is that I argue that the transhumanist impulse is a very strange one, because it rests on a logic. I mean, a couple of logics, but one of them, as applied to people, is that we so want to transform the human beings so they are no longer recognizably human, at which point you ask, why are we doing this in the first place?
Mm.
Because what is planned is not just the obsolescence of humans, but the erasure of humans into some yet to be sort of discovered, engineered being, whatever that would be.
Yeah.
And it's the same with the transhumanist impulse that wants to terraform other planets, which is, it also rests on a really confused logic, because it assumes that by going somewhere else, life will suddenly be better, without realizing that the somewhere else is not at all in any way sort of biologically, physiologically, biochemically suited for a human being's existence. And so to think that we're going to go somewhere else, terraform a planet in ways we can't even begin to understand, and live better, when we can't live well on a planet that is exactly tuned for our flourishing, we're deeply confused. And so, putting our hope in someone like Elon Musk as sort of the prototypical techno guy who's going to save us is just deeply, deeply troubling. And I wanted to call attention to that, what I think is a really misconstrued logic that underpins both the effort to perfect human beings and to go to some other planet.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so strange to think, that our technologies are causing so many problems, and people think, oh, then more technology.
Yeah.
Like, well, that's you're kind of doubling down on that there, and maybe maybe it'd be good to find another way or think about limits. Especially appreciate you saying, that you want to keep indoor plumbing and stuff like that.
Right.
But sometimes that is, as soon as you critique this kind of technophilia, then people say, oh, so you just want us to go back to, before we had electricity and stuff like
Right.
that. You're like, no,
Yeah.
there's some kind of enough that we need to find, some kind of limits.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good word, that word enough. And here too, I would say we don't have many forums in which, as communities of people, we can talk about what that is, right? When have people reached enough?
Hmm.
Because here is the startling thing. If you imagine talking to somebody who lived 100 years ago, for instance, they would find our lives unimaginable because of the many comforts and conveniences it affords. And the question would be, why are we still not satisfied? And I think the best way to make sense of this historically is to say that human beings are the kinds of beings that compare themselves to others. And whenever you start that game, you always find someone who's doing more, has more, looks better, whatever. And so you're perpetually dissatisfied. And that's a recipe for disaster. And I think this is why in Jewish and Christian traditions in particular, it's so important to keep this idea of the Sabbath in our minds, because the Sabbath is precisely that regular time where people ask about what they have, why they should celebrate what they have. It's also why practices of Thanksgiving are so important. And
Mhm.
here, indigenous folks have so much to teach us about the need to regularly reflect as a community about the many ways in which our places, our habitats, our communities, are sources of our livelihood that are a blessing. Doesn't mean they're not difficult or that they can't be bothersome and disagreeable, even, but nonetheless, we can't live without them. And so I think practices of Thanksgiving and Sabbath are really, really vital at this very moment when we have not just lost the brakes, but have assumed that stepping on the accelerator will solve every problem.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really great. I've heard people, refer to the idea of the Sabbath year as well, and the Jubilee year, and I know
Right?
part of that also involves, forgiveness of debt,
Yeah.
and that seems that's such a massive problem
Yes.
across, all the whole planet right now. Countries in debt, individuals in debt.
Right.
So then it seems like there's a pretty serious critique of capitalism in what you're saying as well.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And here, you're bringing up debt is, I think, so, so important because I think for many people today, it's impossible to imagine a world apart from the debt imaginary.
Yeah.
Right? We're always in a financial hole with respect to somebody else. And it's a truly sinister phenomenon. So, for instance, if you think about how imperial gestures by countries over the last 200 years or so have raped and pillaged whole continents and then put them in debt
Yeah.
and then required these communities of people to service the debt rather than take care of their own communities, to take care of their own habitats. It's not just sinister, it's deeply evil.
Yeah.
And most everybody knows that these countries are not in a position where they're ever going to pay off their debts, and it's not as though these countries are expecting that this debt will somehow alleviate their own national problems, but that debt can't be forgiven
Yeah.
because of some crazy logic that assumes that this is the world that we live in, where you always pay your debts, when the Sabbath and the Jubilee are the reminder that nobody should be in a condition of desperation or misery. Nobody should be in a position that they can profit off of another person's misery or misfortune, which is also why usury is such a problematic
Right.
practice in religious traditions. So I think you're raising a really, really important point in which now money is the determining factor, not just for how we live in the world, but what we think about the world, what we think about each other, and what we think about our obligations. Because people have obligations, they just do, because we're constantly depending on what other people can do to help us to live. But an obligation is very different than a financial debt.
Yeah.
And being able to distinguish those two things is really important because one's a moral economy and one's a financial economy. And the moral economy, which is devoted to developing relationships, is quite different than a monetary economy, which is about contracts and legality and things of that sort.
Nice. That's a good distinction. Yeah, and so then the moral economy, like paying attention to that, would be a solution to the problem of the financial economy run amok.
Exactly. I mean, think here about how so many traditional or indigenous cultures, when they operate in a moral economy, it's an economy that's based on sharing and gift giving.
Hmm.
And that's not to say there isn't money in them, right? Gift
Right.
economies often had money associated with them and transactions too.
Hmm.
But the difference is that the relationships are governed by the sense that we all need each other. And so, in the damaging of others, we also always damage ourselves. right? And of course, that's something the capitalist economy doesn't understand at all,
Yeah.
because it's going through this world, through all of our communities, doing tremendous damage to people and places, and in the process, not seeing how this is undermining the very viability of a future.
Yeah. Seems like such a simple point to say. Like, has anybody thought about sharing? We're like,
We
no,
were taught
that's
that in kindergarten, right?
yeah, right. It's a kindergarten lesson, and then
Right.
somehow we're like, yeah, but that's just for kids. And
I know.
here in the grown-up world, that's things are harsh, and this is the reality we have to deal with. No, not
Yeah.
really. For the vast majority of the history of our species, we didn't do this.
Yeah.
Um, and so I like one of the phrases in your book, you refer to the rooted life, and this idea that we're kind of getting back into place, and that there's that root in tradition as well as kind of spatially in your
Yeah.
environment. But, getting back into those roots that will help us, find what the limits of what enough is. We just have
Right.
to remember.
Yeah, and I think this is not a small point, because there's so much in philosophical and theological traditions that don't want us to think about rootedness,
Yeah.
right? So there's two ways we can go at this. One is to just think about the number of spiritualities that populate our religious traditions, in which the trajectory is always up and away.
Mm,
And it's a disembodied movement
yeah.
often, right? So that's one stream that gets us into trouble with rootedness. But the second one is more of a Western philosophical notion, which is, of course, we have this thing called the hierarchy of being, where you've
Mm,
got soil at the bottom, then plants, then animals, then humans, then angels, and then God on top. Well, this is a version of the sort of gradations in being, which makes a very clear distinction between plants and humans. And we are above plants, and therefore we don't think that plants are much to learn from. Aristotle put this down famously in his book De Anima, on the soul, but it's been carried forward. We think that it's somehow beneath us to try to pay attention to plants, to see how they help us understand what it means to be a creature.
mhm,
And one of the things I wanted to do in the book is actually attend to what we can learn from plants
mm,
about rooted existence, because a person who I've grown to really love is Robin Kimmerer, and her
mhm.
book Braiding Sweetgrass is now the rage by everyone.
Yeah.
But she makes these fabulous points about how plants, in their very being, create fertility, create
Mhm,
oxygen. They do it all without poisoning anything. They do it while standing still. And as Wendell Berry says, they provide shade and fruit
mhm,
in the process. And this is something that, you read some of these indigenous writers, they say, what if we were to learn from our elder sisters and brothers called the plants about what it means to live in our places in a non-contentious way? Whereas so many of the ways that we think about inhabiting a place is to be in struggle with it from the beginning.
mm,
And that has done so much damage. And so to try to figure out, right, what plants teach us about rootedness, what plants teach us about opening ourselves up to the dark of the soil, or opening ourselves up to the atmosphere, right? That these become ways of transforming what we think a human being is. And while it is true that we can move about because we've got this facility called locomotion, the reality is that everything we need comes from the land, in the ways of our feeding, and the ways of our drinking, in the ways of our breathing, our touching, our energizing ourselves, our building our homes. Everything draws us back into the ground. And so that ability, that facility to move about, has caused us to think that we're not rooted. But of
right,
course, it's an illusion, right? The roots are there every time you take a bite.
mm.
And we just need to be reminded of that, I think.
That's nice. That's a nice point. Yeah, it's easy to think we're separate from the environment just because we can jump up and down and things are like, look, we're clearly not part of the earth.
Yeah, yeah.
Like,
And
no,
we can go
that's
somewhere else if we're not happy where we are, right?
yeah, exactly. It's like you can run a few miles. That means
Yeah,
I have this freedom, and that's always been how the kind of chain of being is articulated. Right? It's degrees of freedom. So
right.
we have this total freedom, and then plants have none, so they're worthless. We got nothing to learn from them.
Yeah, and Amitav Ghosh has this marvelous observation in his book, The Great Derangement, where he says you can actually chart how freedom gets described in the modern period by laying it alongside how far removed you are from landed embodied realities,
Yeah.
right? So if you're a farm worker, if you're a slave, if you're a woman, right, because you're tied to biorhythms in a way that men presume not to be, right, you're diminished in your capacity for freedom. And so the emancipatory ideal in so many of its sort of iterations presumes separation from the land, separation from body, separation from manual work, right? Because these are all ways of being that tie us to land and therefore also tie us to limits. And so emancipation means the obliteration of limits, but that just opens the doors for new forms of violation.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Freedom to violate. Yeah. Instead of freedom as this kind of open hearted participation in all of your relationships.
Right.
So yeah, it's always that's such a difficult thing to hear. Anytime people talk about freedom, they want their freedom. It's like, what exactly do you want? They're like, I want to be able to harm others. I'm like, oh no.
Well, and this too, I mean, it brings us to another point in the book, which is a really important one for me, and that is what we understand a human being to be, right? If you think about human beings as individuals, freedom will register in a way that is vastly different than if you think about freedom being worked out in persons who are by their very nature social ecological beings. And so, an idea that I developed that I get from Tim Ingold is this idea that we live in a meshwork world.
Right.
And a meshwork world is a world in which there is no self standing being. No human being stands by him or herself. No human being can exist from out of themselves. No human being is strictly autonomous because we're so deeply enmeshed, entangled within the lifelines of other people, other creatures, geophysical processes, so that for any of those lines of co development to be cut is to be diminished in your ability to be at all. And so we've been living with this illusion that human beings are individuals because we have this thing called skin that seems to present us with this boundary that separates us. And there are, it's not just sort of the sort of aesthetic dimension here that makes us think we're individuals. It's also a deeply philosophical notion, which is this idea that to be a human being is to be a substance who defines him or herself by not being anything else.
Right.
And that's an inherently abstracting, individuating philosophical move. And what we need to do is resist that and help people understand how much they are a plurality, that they are, as I put it, verbs more than they are nouns.
Yeah.
Because as verbs, you understand that who you are is a feature of your constantly being involved with the co-becoming of other beings. And when you understand that, that complicates the notion of freedom even further, because what I'm able to do is so much a feature of my own upbringing. So my being a white male presents opportunities that would never present to somebody else, because white men have all of this benefit of being in a culture where white maleness has become the prize. And there's so much that's sinister about that in the histories, and we can talk about that if you want to. But we need to appreciate that how an African American girl living in poverty, how she will think about freedom is so different. And it's not because she's not an individual person, she is, but she's coming up in a world that has vastly different potential, vastly different limits. And so to call attention to us being entangled in social ecological worlds, and this is really important, it's so important for us to know that, because then we can work on the conditions that prevent this African American girl from actually flourishing, right? We can start attending to the economies that keep her poor. We can attend to the habitats that are likely to make her sick because she's living in a Superfund site or who knows what, right? That we can address the educational contexts which do not give her the same opportunities that other people growing up in affluence have, right? So helping us see how we live in a meshwork world means that we take freedom out of the place of individual virtue and vice
Yeah.
and put it in the systems, right? The social ecological systems that either prevent or enable people to flourish. And I think that's where we really need to be taking our conversation, because still, I think so much talk about environmental theology is at the level of individual virtue or vice, right? What
Yeah.
are you going to do as an individual? Will
Yeah.
you drive a Prius? Will you
Right.
eat vegan or whatever? And that just doesn't go deeply enough.
Yeah. I think that's a really great way to think about that, because it's something I struggle with. It's like you try to say, well, freedom isn't just this individual thing, and we don't just want to focus on individuals. And say, well, then what would freedom look like? And you're like, it's contextual, it's relational, it's
Yeah,
nourishing the context that provide the opportunities for people to flourish.
right.
I think that's a great way to reframe that. That's
And this is
very
where we can
powerful.
again learn from other traditions where, indigenous people, they would never think about themselves as individuals,
Yeah,
or think about African traditions of Ubuntu, right?
right.
You cannot see yourself apart from the flourishing of others,
Yeah,
because in their sadness, you are sad.
yeah,
And of course, Christians, they have a pretty good text to go by here when Paul talks about the body of Christ, right? And this is important because I think Paul understood, as does much of Scripture, that human beings are social beings. Right? We don't use the political term that Aristotle gave, but put in a Christian way, we're ecclesial beings.
yeah,
And to be an ecclesial being means that you can only live when you're part of a membership in which each person, each member, has the good of each other as their foremost aim. And to get to a place where the ecclesia is not just human, but includes the
yeah,
whole of creation, right? I think that's the next move that needs to be made, because it's pretty clear from a scriptural point of view that God's covenant is with the whole of creation, not
yeah.
just people, and that God's redemptive reconciling purposes are not just with people, but with the whole of creation. So I don't think there's any reason we couldn't say that the ecclesia, or the kingdom of God, is human specific. It isn't.
Right. Yeah, sometimes I wonder, like, why would that be a controversial thing to say? It's pretty clear in the scriptures. If you're not
Yeah,
reading
it
it
is.
with an anthropocentric lens on, then you're like,
Right.
oh yeah, it's right here. We had Rabbi Laura Duhan Kaplan on the show recently, and her book Mouth of the Donkey:
Yeah.
Reimagining Biblical Animals is like that. And you're reading it, you're like, oh yeah, it's multi-species kinship everywhere.
Oh, yeah.
And so, like, how did we all miss this? And like, why was there a kind of anthropocentric reading of scripture favored in the first place?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's a really interesting question. I mean, I think one version of it would be that histories of biblical interpretation go through ebbs and flows where certain ideas or paradigms dominate. And I think we're still living very much within the sort of paradigm that came to us from 19th century idealist
Mhm.
philosophy or existentialist philosophy in the early 20th century, where it's all about the human being. And people like Gerhard von Rad and G. Ernest Wright in this country, they really gave us this idea that Israel is about history, right? It's not about
Mm,
nature, because that would be paganism. And what that has done has been hugely distorting of our ability to read scripture, because the animism is there from the beginning, right? And the multi-species flourishing is there from the beginning, right? Remember, the Adam, when is told not to be lonely because it's not good to be lonely, the first partner potential is the animals.
yeah,
So to think that human beings can somehow be what they are apart from kinship with not just other humans, but with the whole of creation, we're now seeing that that's just a bad theological mistake, but it's certainly also a bad physiological mistake.
yeah, yeah. Right. Wrong on so many
Yeah,
levels.
right.
And I wonder, shifting toward this more kind of relational sensibility, and away from the idea that, being a good environmentalist means practicing personal virtues, like, drive a Prius or whatever.
Right.
Where does eating come into this? Because I know you've written a lot about this,
Yeah.
and I think the idea that we should just try to not eat things that are high on the chain of
Right. Right.
being. You
Yeah.
want to
Yeah.
eat as low on the chain of being as possible. But if the
Yeah.
chain of being isn't so simple anymore,
Yeah.
then, like,
Yeah.
what am I supposed to eat?
Yeah. 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 Oh boy, there's an enormous number of questions here. To start, I think again the idea of personal virtue and vice is a mistake, right? Because people are participating in food systems over which they have no control. right? Very little say. And so to, for instance, blame a working class person who buys cheap, convenient food because they're working two jobs and it's all they can afford, that's doubly egregious,
Yeah.
right? Because they don't want this system. They know it's not good for them. They know it's not making them healthy. And so you really have to get to the level of systems. And I would say you have to think about it on, well, at least two levels, but more. You have to look at it economically, but also then ecologically. And by economically, what I mean is we have to start talking about food policy. We need to talk about agricultural policy, because right now, what we have is an agricultural system that we know is so destructive. It's destructive of soil, it's destructive of water, right? Poisoning, exhausting our freshwater resources. We know that it's also deeply damaging, right, to the farmers themselves, who are seeing increased rates of indebtedness. And so it's an agricultural system that in many instances isn't even growing food for people. It's growing commodities, or it's growing food for the large animal feeding operations that
Right.
populate our countryside. And so on so many levels, we've got a farm bill that encourages bad agriculture and bad food, right? So if you actually grow food, vegetables or fruits, for instance, you don't get support from the USDA, the US Department of Agriculture, because what you're doing is called a specialty crop,
Mm.
right? And the question is, why is food a specialty crop? But growing corn to make diapers or to feed cattle, that's food, and that should be
Mm.
supported, right? There's something very strange about that. So we need to be talking about food and agricultural systems because they're so damaging. We also know they're contributing enormous amounts of CO2,
Right.
right, to greenhouse gas issues. So that's one level we can talk, but we also need to talk on the ecological level. And that is, there's no question that if we just stick with America, there's way too much meat that's being consumed. A lot of that meat is being produced in ways, as I've just described, that are deeply destructive of our lands and agricultural communities. So we should eat less meat, but that doesn't mean necessarily that we should not eat meat altogether, because from a strictly ecological point of view, there is no viable habitat that doesn't have animals in it. And so to think that we're going to farm our lands without having animals on them is a huge mistake. And so we really need to talk then about what would responsible animal husbandry look like,
Mm-hmm.
right? What do we need to do there? And there are ways to talk about this that actually build soil. And this is important because building topsoil sequesters carbon,
Right.
which is to say then that diverse agricultural farming practices can actually play a vital role in addressing some of our Anthropocene concerns that we have. But that's going to mean changing our agriculture pretty dramatically, because it requires then to have an agriculture that works with nature rather than against
Yeah.
nature. And so it's not just organic, but we need to be talking about regenerative agricultural systems that build topsoil without the use of synthetic fertilizers, without the applications of so many herbicides. And that actually, and this is also a really important one, develop the kinds of agricultural policy that put people back on the land.
Yeah.
Nothing like a back to the land movement here, but we're talking about the reinvigoration of local farming practices where farms are small or families farm the land that they actually live on. Because right now, so much of our land is being farmed by people or owned by people who will never step on the land, right? It's
Yeah.
owned by executives in Chicago or New York or Saudi
Right.
Arabia or what have you. And so what we've got is a much dysfunctional agricultural system. Now, what does this mean for our eating choices? Well, if we advocate for a food policy that actually compensates farmers who grow food, that will bring the price of real food down, right?
Right.
And if we start doing that, it'll create the opportunities for people who don't have means to be able to get food that we know is good for them. My solution is not for everyone to go to Whole Foods, not at all,
Right.
right? Because that just buys into a system that has already got a lot of problems. But
Yeah.
it is about invigorating local food economies, developing food co-ops in
Mm.
which the relationships between consumers and producers, right, become strengthened.
Right.
And there's lots of ways, and there's, if we wanted, we could get into some of the specifics about ventures that are being done right now that are very successful, that are very affordable, um, but they're bucking against a majorly big and well-financed system that does not want to change, right? The fossil fuel lobby and the corn lobby, they love the system that we
Right.
now have because so much of our food requires us to use so many fossil fuels just to produce it.
Right. Yeah, that's tough. That's, seems like such an insurmountable problem. And yet, if I hang out at a farmer's market, I'm kind of like, oh no, so we're doing it.
Well, it does seem so insurmountable, but it's remarkable to see the kinds of changes that have happened, right? If I just think about our area here in North Carolina, where if you came here 30 years ago, there was nothing going on here with small scale agriculture, with farmers markets, with farm to table dining. None of that was happening. Co ops didn't exist. But in the course of 30 years, it's changed so dramatically. We have so much locally grown food. We have so much farm to table. There's so many healthy food options, right? There's hardly a restaurant around now that doesn't like to say how they got their ingredients from
Right.
local area farmers. Now, this is not to say it's a perfect system. It's not. But we can make changes. And this is where I think faith communities have so much to contribute because they are one of the few places where people can still speak meaningfully about how food is a gift. It's not just
Mm.
a commodity. And that, as I say, food is actually the expression of God's love for us. And so, for us to be thinking about food not as a commodity, but as divine love made nutritious, that changes the way we think about it, also how we're going to sort of purchase it, deploy it, offer it to other people. So religious traditions, I think, can play a major role. And in my dream of dreams, my realization is that religious communities all around the world have discovered that if they get eating right, you actually literally change the world,
Mhm.
not just on the sort of ecological level because we have good farming now, but also the social level because eating is fundamentally about being hospitable with each other. And imagine a world in which people were hospitable with each other. That would be that would be incredible.
Yeah, that's a good. I'll take that dream of dreams.
All right,
That
good.
sounds good to me. And yeah, I mean, you think like there's over 2 billion Christians on the planet. So even if it was just Christian communities doing this,
Right.
that's massive amounts of change. And you get good food. Like,
Yeah.
save the world. How? Oh, some food. You get to
Yeah,
eat.
good food. Wouldn't that be wonderful, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I love it.
Yeah, that's really, it seems so simple. It seems like, there's a lot of kind of Wendell Berry influence in some of your
Yeah,
thinking.
right.
Has he
Yeah, I
been
mean, yeah, so
pretty
that I mean
formative?
there's a long story there, but just the brief end of it would be I grew up thinking I was going to be a farmer myself, and then because of just the finances of farming in the 80s in particular, it was impossible to conceive. And so, I thought I'd be a teacher and ended up studying philosophy, and there wasn't a farmer in sight. And I thought I was done with all of that. But then I moved to Kentucky, you know, 25 years or so ago now, and I got to know Wendell as a
Mm,
friend and as a mentor, really,
mm,
because he's a farmer who helped me understand that agrarian traditions are not just for farmers, right? Agrarian traditions actually include and encompass a whole culture of life that is deep and philosophically, spiritually, aesthetically profound in the way it understands what the world is, what the human place in the world is. And so he introduced me to all these agrarian writers that are all around the world, right? Asia, Africa, South America, you name it. There are these agrarian writers. And I sort of set myself the task of bringing agrarian traditions into the ways that I think philosophically and theologically, because it's the case that when you disembody and you start to think about the human being in abstraction from land, you really develop a distorted picture of so much of what human life is about. And it's reflected even, I think, in environmentalism in this country, where the go-to place for environmentalism is wilderness, which by
right.
definition is the place people don't belong. And that's just goofy, right? Why would we try to develop an environmental ethic based upon the premise that you don't really belong, you just visit?
Yeah.
And so agricultural traditions, which are very diverse, right? We need to remember that. They start with the assumption that human beings belong on the land, and land understood very expansively here. And so the agricultural traditions are so important to attend to, because in attending to those histories, you can see where people fail, but also where
Mm,
they succeed.
mm,
And that's where the real learning happens, I think, when you have to come to terms with successes and failures,
yeah,
so that we can then figure out what would it look like to move forward in ways that don't destroy our lands, that don't degrade the sources of life,
yeah,
that don't damage the communities that grow us our food and our fiber, and that help us harvest our energy. Right? Learning how to do that is going to require us to go to agrarian traditions, is my
yeah,
view, um, not wilderness people. I mean, I love
yeah,
reading some of John Muir, and I love going into wilderness. Right? I grew up in the shadow of the Rockies, so I love it. But I'm not presuming that I'm going to live on Mount Crandall. That's not a place for human beings to live.
yeah. Yeah, such an important point. No, there's a lot of indigenous critiques of the wilderness concept for that,
Right?
kind of reason. They're like, no, we lived here, we were removed from it, and then you get to call it
Well, yeah,
wilderness.
and the history of American parks is precisely that,
Yeah,
right? You go to Yellowstone to create a park, and what do you do first? You remove the
yeah,
indigenous peoples. What a violation.
yeah,
And also, what a distortion of what a place is and what
yeah,
human beings are, because it assumes people don't belong, which is wrong.
yeah,
And then it assumes that people who make their living, right, their livelihood from close attachment to the land are somehow inferior beings.
yeah,
And both of those are just egregious.
yeah. Yeah, I think the idea that humans belong is such an important point. It says, the kind of idea like, oh, we should go terraform Mars and stuff like that. It's like,
Yeah.
no, we evolved here. Our bodies are really, this is home. And so
Yeah.
to reconnect with your place as home instead of wilderness as some exotic other that you get to,
Yeah.
have
Yeah.
some inspirational experience with. Yeah, it just seems so crucial. Everybody's so
Right. Right.
alienated, and you're just like, no, your body belongs
Yeah.
here.
And Robin Kimmerer, she has this wonderful section in Braiding Sweetgrass where she says, she thinks that a lot of the psychoses of Western culture stems from the inability of most people to feel that the land loves them.
Mm,
Right? So it's not just that you sort of belong in a place, but that where you are actually loves you. Because if you have the experience of growing things or harvesting things when you go foraging or whatever, she says to find strawberries or to find mushrooms or to find fruit growing in your garden is a kind of declaration of the land wanting you to thrive,
yeah,
not just survive, but to thrive, and not just thrive, but to enjoy the taste of a fresh raspberry. I mean, that's marvelous.
mhm,
And so many people don't have that experience. And because of that, they feel alienated and alone, and they feel themselves to be on a planet that doesn't care for them. And because the planet doesn't care for them, why should anybody care for them? And
yeah,
so, having rendered the world valueless, all the life that's on it is now also valueless, including your own. And when you have that kind of psychoses, Kimmerer says you're going to develop all sorts of compensatory strategies
mm,
to try to show that you count, that you matter, that you are valuable. And we've seen how a lot of those compensatory strategies in the form of acquisition, commodification, exploitation,
yeah,
they do so much harm to each other, to our places, and to ourselves. And so to come into the place and find it as a place of belonging, a place where you are loved, is one of the most important things we can cultivate in each other. And here too, agrarian traditions have so much to teach us, because it's through the physical labor of working with land and plants and animals that you discover how you grow out of places, literally, and are blessed by them. And so might actually begin to think of your life as a blessing rather than as a curse. And mind you, agrarian traditions are very clear that when you say you grow out of the land and that you are blessed by the land, this is not always an easy blessing or a comfortable blessing, because sometimes the cow that you love will kick you in the head, right? Or sometimes when you reach for a fruit in the ground, there will be a snake that will bite you, right? So it's not as though it's a painless world that we live in, but despite its pain and frustration, it's still a beautiful world, a delicious world. And so we need to figure out how to cultivate in each other the skills whereby we can move gently in the places we're in rather than so negligently, so blindly, and so aggressively, because these are doing so much harm.
Yeah, that's such an important difference from like mainstream environmentalism is just like a lot of doom and gloom. And even if there's like save the world kind of rhetoric, there's never this sense like, you know, to some extent, this is all a blessing. It's
Yeah,
it's good and like there's pain, there's suffering, but in the larger context, it's more of a celebration.
yeah,
And if it was, you know, even just framing it that way might open people more to like, okay, then this kind of life can actually be fulfilling. It's not
yeah,
just hard work. I don't just have to leave all the pleasures of technological civilization. You get to
yeah,
have more pleasures through intimate contact with your place. So you
yeah.
actually have more joy. It's got a joyous approach to environmentalism.
Yeah, no, that's really wonderful. And I think what you're just saying has so much to say about hope as well, right? Because so many people are despairing and for very good reasons, right? But I'm writing a book on hope right now, and in it, one of my starting assumptions is that hope is not something we produce. It's certainly not anything we just invent. In fact, hope is less a noun than it is a verb, and by a verb I mean hope is about joining with the power of life around you, and that means that we don't depend on ourselves to fix the planet. What we do is we try to connect with what I will say are the sacred or divine power at work in the world that over the last several billion years have been creating this fertility and fecundity and diversity of life that are just beautiful and delicious and good. And so for us to be able to learn how to connect with that is so important and participate in that power. And of course, that's become rather difficult because so many of the forms of life that people now occupy don't foster connection, right? I mean, think about the people who are writing books titled things like Lost Connection, right? Life alone, bowling alone, right? These are all ways that we have of describing that people don't resonate, right? And resonating, I think, is a very important word here with the life and the places around them. And so figuring out how to make the connections real and vital so that we can feel the power of life coursing through the world around us and through our own bodies is going to be a big first step in activating hope, because insofar as we sort of give up on the world, see its different places and processes being degraded over and over again, we might lose sight of the power that is still active, that has always been active in our world.
Yeah, and it seems like that connects well with what you're saying in the book about creativity.
Yeah.
There's this kind of wellspring of power that we can tap into. That's just part of us being creatures.
Yeah. And one of the things I tried to do in the book is show how the logics of creation, creatureliness, and creativity really hang together in important ways. And the creativity is a big part of that because the creativity helps us understand that we're creatures
Yeah.
and that we live in a world of gifts. And by creativity, I don't mean anything like the artistic genius in a more or less tortured mode imposes a vision upon a world, right?
Right.
That is as far away from creativity as I can think you get. I mean, it's so much the effect of what we were talking about earlier, right? To be free is to extricate yourself as an individual from virtually everything and then be tortured in your aloneness.
Yeah.
Um, that's not what creativity is. As I say it, creativity is your participation in the world's unfolding of itself. And that means we learn to see how the world is constantly generating life and making possible our participation through the varying modes of making things, right? Making a garden shed, making a meal, making a piece of music, right? That all of these ways of making become our immersion into processes that are long at work in the world, constantly at work. And so when we make, what we do is we come to a deeper attention of what's going on around us, but also a deeper appreciation of the many gifts that are constantly circulating through us. And we have the chance to take our love and our skill and join it to the love that's always at work in the world. And when we do that, we make the world more beautiful. We make the world more delicious. We make the world more fragrant. And I think people have a deep longing to engage in that kind of activity because I think deep down, a lot of us really want to believe that what we do, how we spend our time, how we deploy our bodies, is contributing to the beautification of the world. And so what I'm arguing for is that we learn to make ourselves more creative beings who through our work, but also through our play, make the world better.
That's wonderful. I have nothing to add to that. I think that's, and it's one of those things where it's just like, you know, all the crises we're facing, the solutions to them are us living better lives. And it's not, you know, us pulling out our hair. You know, there's all this
Yeah,
sense that there's a kind of asceticism to environmentalism. Like, no, it can be really tasty and fun.
yeah,
It can be playful.
right.
So I think you're providing a really great context for people to engage with that kind of work.
Well, thank
And
you.
geez, I don't know. We try to keep these episodes under an hour. I'm like, I could just chat with you all day, and at some point, I'm like,
Even
no,
better if we had a meal going on at the same time.
that's true. Really,
Yeah,
ideally, that's how this show would operate. Is I'd be
yeah.
in person with people. We could have some food, hang out on a farm, maybe.
Someday maybe that'll happen, Sam. That would be great.
Yeah, well, I hope so. But for now, I really appreciate you coming on and talking about this sacred life. It's a really, really beautiful work in a long line of great work that you're doing. So thanks so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me, Sam. I appreciated the conversation.
And thanks for everybody for tuning in. We'll be back next week with some more conversations for you. And in the meantime, take care and be well.